Hi everyone, my name is Mark Bell and I'm here to show you Polycom's Real Presence Resource Manager specifically with phone provisioning the VVX series of phones. So traditionally in the old days there was really only one mainstream solution for provisioning, or rather two mainstream solutions for provisioning Polycom phones. You either had to use the Polycom provisioning server, which was basically your own FTP site, and you do a bunch of XML configuration files and DHCP options to configure the phones to auto boot from those XML files hosted in the FTP, or you had to use Event Zero's UC commander. Recently, Polycom released the 10.1 of their Real Presence Resource Manager, which has been traditionally focused around the video conferencing systems, and now they've added an additional module, as it were, to RPRM for short, in version 10.1, and that covers the phone provisioning solution for the VVX series and the Polycom Trio. So when you get the appliance from Polycom, you have an option of VMware or Hyper-V, and you can host that in your environment. On the server, for the maximum resources that it requires, from 16 gig of RAM, 4 CPUs, and that should support around about, I think it's about 20,000 phones, I think, off the top of my head. But if you reduce the resources, obviously the amount of phones that device can support at any one time reduces as well. So there's a sizing exercise to take on board there. The appliance itself runs on CentOS OS, version 6, I think it is, from memory. And all the management is done through the web-based UI. It's ridiculously easy to install. It's literally import the virtual machine appliance, assign it an IP address, and log in, and away you go. Essentially, you do have to configure your DHCP options on your DHCP server, which I'll show you now. And they're the usual candidates of DHCP option 160 and 161. If I just log into my DHCP server now. So coming to DHCP, if you've got Windows DHCP options, you'll be familiar with this interface. And if we have a look at the scope options, we can see here that we've got DHCP 160 and 161 configured, and it's pointing to the IP address of the RPRM server /phone service /config files, and that's where the VVX and Trio phones will look for their boots and application config. Other points to note, that if you've got Skype for Business and you want to do PIN authentication, then you still do need the DHCP options for Skype for Business in your scope. And the other important options are DHCP 42 and option 2. So 42 is the NTP server, so that's typically your NTP server in your domain. And the 02 is the time offset, so that's the time offset against GMT that your DHCP server observes. So if you've got one DHCP server, you probably want to set your offset to 0, even if you're in the US and you've got a global deployment. If you've got regional DHCP servers, then you can configure your offset in here. It's not hard required, because the phones, you can configure your offset manually in the config files too. So moving on to the interface. So first thing I want to cover is that when you get the appliance from Polycom, it comes with a self-signed certificate, so that if you wanted to do HTTPS zero-touch provisioning with your phones, so that it go and gets the config files and the boot files from the RPRM server using HTTPS instead of HTTP, then you have to really speak to distribution about getting your internal root certificate put onto the Polycom phones that you're buying in bulk in advance, or you have to manually log into the phones and install a certificate when you get them or when you have them delivered. So to get around that, if you want it completely zero touch, then what you could do is provision of HTTP, but then offer a redirect to HTTPS once you've deployed the certificate. But I'm not going to cover that today. I'm just going to show you the simple interface. So when you sign in can be local sign-in or Active Directory or integrated. It's your choice. And obviously there's a setup for that. So the first thing I wanted to show you is the dashboard, and really it shows here that how many endpoints you've got the RPRM servers discovered, and this little sitemap here, which I'll go into now. So most of this interface here is geared specifically for video conferencing. So the areas that we're going to focus on are going to be endpoint and network topology. So the first thing that you want to do is you want to create your site. So these are similar to sites in Skype for Business, for instance. What you're essentially doing is giving your site a name. This is all really irrelevant, but you specify a location and you can go and search for city in the country, and return back the longitude and latitude coordinates for your location. That populates the map that you saw on the dashboard. But interestingly, what you want to do here is assign the subnets that you have for that site in this subnets tab here. And what that will do is that when the phone is connected to this particular subnet, RPRM knows which site that phone is instantly in, so it helps that zero touch provisioning. So if we look at site topology here, we can see that I've created two sites where I'm based at home, and obviously a dummy one in New York. Interestingly, if you don't configure sites, everything goes into this internet VPN, so catch-all container or site. So it's good to break this out. When you talk about specifically about phones, the bandwidth limits between sites and what have you, site-to-site exclusions, site links and all that type of stuff, it doesn't really come into it, and that's specifically for video. So when you create your endpoint, so if you come into endpoint, the main areas that you're going to be focusing on is monitor view, endpoint groups, and phone management. And under phone management is pretty much everything that you need to do with a phone. So just going to cover off the phone management settings for now. So these are all the default settings, and if you have a look at the provisioning account, this is a default provisioning account that Polycom ship with all their phones and their hardware. So if you want to change this, you can do, but then you impact your zero touch capability, because you're going to have to log into the phones and change that Polycom provisioning password to get access to the config files. So recommend that you leave this blank. Again, you can change it if you want to, but just be aware of that. So resource files. This is where you're going to upload all your resource files like music on hold, ringtones, background images, and stuff like that. So you're going to upload them to here. And then in this upload software updates, you're going to upload the split version of the UCS firmware for each of your phones, models and what have you. So this is where you upload the firmware. If we talk about configuration profiles for a moment, these are all the configuration profiles. So if you've used XML files in the past, you'll be familiar with these settings. If you've used Event Zero in the past, you'd be familiar with these profile type configurations. So out of the box, Polycom give you up to, well, I've got a few custom ones in here, so about 320 or so out of the box configurations that Polycom give you for standard. But Some people obviously would like to create their own, so to make it a bit more specific for your environment and understandable. So you can create your own by clicking on the plus button, and you can filter these out. So if you look by profile name, and if you've got a naming standard like I have for my lab, which is MC, I can search and I can bring back all the profile names for my sites and devices. So here we can see that we've got a global one, we've got an endpoint one, endpoint group, and we'll come to that in a minute. So just to give you a view into this config, so go to configuration attributes, you can see here that what I'm doing here is setting my device profile to link, setting the local admin password. Interestingly enough, on this, once your phones are connected to RPRM, what it will do is it will enable the REST API and a few other bits and pieces automatically, even with zero configuration. And that requires the admin password to be reset from the default 456, and it'll be set to 789 unless you deploy your own global profile. Just to sum that up. So here I can change that to for instance, and I'm also here saying, well, yeah, I'm going to enable screen capture, and this is just for my lab, you wouldn't normally do this, and I'm going to basically allow HTTP 80, and I'm going to do it over normal HTTP rather than require HTTPS. So these are how you build your profile. So if I wanted to add a specific configuration to this configuration profile, I can just type in anything I want. Let's say I want to do paging, for instance. I can type in that, and it'll come up to with the relevant options in IntelliSense. Not every single option is listed in this IntelliSense. So let's say you want to do a push to talk, for instance. You want to add a multicast address. You just click on this, scroll down, and then add in your multicast address if it was different from the default one that Polycom use. Again, you can delete config by clicking on the recycle button. But if for whatever reason, and there are a couple of configurations settings that aren't in this IntelliSense, if you wanted to add your own, you can come in here and simply type in the parameter you want. So here you could add in the feature for device lock, for instance, off the top of my head, and then you can put in that 1 or 0 for yes or no. So you can add custom features or configurations as you want. Also, if you've got existing Polycom provisioning solution, let's say you've got FTP and you're migrating to this, you can go and get your custom XML files and import them into these configuration profiles and populate the same. You can even paste the XML into here if you've got different options and what have you. So it's really quite good for importing your config. One thing to note though is that as soon as you configure the DHCP options to look at the RPRM server, it's going to be the RPRM server that's going to deliver your config. So you need to make sure that all your existing profiles are being migrated into this solution before you roll this out live. So if I wanted to upload firmware, for instance, so typically you can create a config file specific for firmware, and all we're doing here is selecting from the drop down menu here the software version that we want to attach this configuration profile. We don't need any attributes configured, it's just a select box here and then press OK. Now moving into profiles deployment, this is where we could attach the configuration profiles to the phones basically. And we want to look at the levels of configuration that you can apply the config at. So here we've got global, and this will apply to all phones globally, hence the word global. And you want to keep this configuration pretty much light as possible. So here you might be configuring just things like your background image, your admin passwords and what have you. You import your certificates for Link or Skype for Business if it's one CA you've got. So anything that you want to apply to every single phone, you put into your global config, and we can click on the edit button here, and we see that there's no config profiles associated. So we can go in here, and we can type in naming convention, which is really quite important, and we can choose our base config, and we can OK that. If we hit apply, what this is going to happen is going to push a reboot to all the phones that are discovered in RPRM. So unless you want to force this, hit OK instead of apply. Next, endpoint groups. So here you can create groups of phones that have that need to share a common configuration. So perhaps you want to configure a group of phones for boss admin, perhaps you want to configure a group of phones for paging, or for hunt groups. Anything that multiple phones need to sort of work together in terms of having the same config. So this is where you would configure your endpoint groups. So when you configure your endpoint group, so let's say I'm going to configure my paging group. So obviously you can add groups, as many groups as you want by clicking on the add button. We can then go into the phone association, the config association, type in our config that we want, and here we've got one for paging. We can apply that config, and then we need to assign that this group to phones, and here we can see we've got 2 phones in my lab, so I can select these and then basically move them down into here. And again, these phones are now associated with this endpoint group, and if I hit apply, the phone's going to reboot. So we'll do that just for a moment. The endpoint models, so it lists out all the endpoints, sound stations, presence, VVX phones, and any config files applied to the endpoint model name will get applied. So let's say you have a common area phone deployment, and you know as a business that you're going to have a VVX 300 phone as a common area phone. So what you could do here is that you could apply a common configuration for specifically for common area phones, so you can lock them down, to whatever security parameters you need, and stop you short of locking them in, for instance. And then any VVX 300 phone that you deploy out there is going to get that configuration. It's important to note before we move on that if you've got a setting applied in global, but then you've got the same setting applied in endpoint groups, it's the endpoint groups that wins. The same if it's in endpoint models and sites and endpoints. So here we can see, it's very much the least or the lowest setting wins. So where the settings applied at the lowest level. So global gets applied first, then endpoint groups and endpoint models, sites, and then endpoints basically. So it doesn't really matter so much where the config goes. Just if it's repeated in separate areas, it's the lowest setting that gets applied. Obviously, you don't want to. There is a thought process behind where you put different types of config. So, for instance, in the sites here, we've got my home office here in Crew. I can edit this, and here I might want to add in my site configuration. So here I've got a site config for Crew. I can apply that and press OK. And then if I wanted to push out an endpoint config, so here I can select the endpoints that I discovered. So at the moment we can see that the status is online, we're not registered, and we've got and this here says it's manually added. So if I had hard reset these phones originally, they would turn up as auto-discovered. The endpoint name is something that you add into RPRM, it's not auto-discovered from the device. But if I wanted to apply a specific endpoint config to VVX1, for instance, so I can come into here and go into configuration profile association, type in that, and so I've got an endpoint 1 configuration. That basically is a config to auto log in the phone. So and I can do the same for VVX2 because I've got one for that. Okay, so now we're ready to configure, well, reboot the phones and basically tell them to pick up the configuration. So if we come up to monitor view, here we can see that we've got all these phones, and if we click on or select the phone and click on the icon here, we can see that we can pick up a lot of information such as MAC address, serial number, who the person is registered to, how long the phone's been online, when it last restarted, when it was last used, when it last got the configuration. We can also see the configuration files that have been pushed out to this phone. So here at the moment we can see this is what is getting pushed out. And this is not the settings that we've just configured, this is just the standard settings that gets pushed out to the phone without any profile set. So this is what's on the phone right now. So here we can see that it's going to set the admin password 789, which is a default, like I said before. It's the notifications server, the polling server. Is polling going to be enabled? And the time for the polling period and when it ends and when it starts and what have you. So this is like the default one. And then we've got all these other phone files that we'll be able to find as we start using the VVX. So there are a couple of good log files that you can look at, and if you want to send all these log files to Polycom Tech Support, you can just download them here and it zips it up and what have you. But anyway, so we click on, we want to reboot the phones, and let's see what happens when we reboot the phones. So here we go to more, selected the endpoints and reboot endpoints. So that sends a reboot to the phones, and the phones will start now provisioning. So we'll be back in a moment. So apparently I've got the selected background images unavailable, so that's probably me not typing the name in right. So if we fix this, go to resource files, copy the background name, go into configuration profiles, into base. Maybe I spelled it wrong somehow. There we go, it's case sensitive. So if we just apply that config now and the phones will reboot. There we go, and that's why we don't want to hit apply straight away, because it will go and restart all your 20,000 phones in one go. So back again in a second. And then eventually, when the phone restarts, it's going to sign back in and have all this configuration. So while that's rebooting and logging in, I just want to go back into the configuration profiles, deployment rather, a bit more, and talk specifically about the config you probably want to put into sites. So here into the crew site, for instance, we've got this configuration profile called SC crew. So the configuration you want to push to a site is going to be things like time zone, daylight saving, settings and what have you, specifically for that site, any other custom configuration that site needs, and you can build out your configuration profiles into that. So if we look at the crew profile and look at the attributes here, we can see that we're setting the time zone for London, we're enabling the daylight saving, so we're starting it on the 3rd month and the last day in the month on the day of week. That should be, yeah, it should be 1 to be honest, because that 1's a Sunday. So I need to change that, and when it's going to stop as well. So, and also we need to provide what setting isn't in here, which I haven't added, is the time at which daylight saving starts and stops. So that's usually 2 AM for the UK. Other countries will have different daylight savings, different time zones. Here, you can configure, basically drop down here to find your time zone, and what that will do then is push out the offset to the phones. So if your DHCP is set to GMT, you can offset the time zone to the one in the local site. And specifically for the endpoint configurations, this is the sort of configuration you want to push specifically to an endpoint. So if the endpoint's got an expander module, you want to customize that specifically. Maybe it's a common area phone, you want to do auto sign-in PIN authentication, then you can do. So here I've got common area phone profile where I'm saying that the login extension is 2103 and I'm setting the PIN, this is the PIN. And if I wanted to use desktop remote connector, I can do. So I've got it connected here, so as you can see my mouse moving on the screen. That's also pretty cool. So once the phones sign in, that's pretty much the phone configured, ready to go. So obviously we've got other configurations here, paging example for instance, setting a page up for the group and assigning it to the phones. So it really makes it quite an intuitive deployment procedure. It's relatively quite slick. So I am actually quite impressed by it, to be honest. So if you've got Polycom phones and you want provisioning solution, I'd seriously consider RPRM as a solution to it. There are a couple of things where I think Event Zero's UDM suite is a little bit better, but we're talking small margins, and I think the biggest win Easy's got over this solution right now is the fact that it can have remote deployment service. So you can have a centralized UDM server, whether that's in the cloud or on premises, and then put a deployment server in a specific location or region to store your config files and your firmware. And then when your phone decides to update the firmware, you push out a new firmware, the phones go to the most optimized location to download that file. So most firmware is about 50 meg, which is not significant for one device, but if several thousand phones decided that they wanted to update relatively at the same period, then that could have some impacts on your WAN. Whereas the RPRM server, everything is stored on the RPRM server. So if you've got this stored centrally and you've got 500 phones in a site sticking off the end of a 1 meg or a 10 meg WAN connection, for instance, then perhaps firmware updates would need to be managed a little bit differently. One thing that this solution hasn't got is the ability to schedule a firmware update. So you can set the polling time where the phones will poll for configuration updates and firmware, and that default usually is between midnight and 5 a.m. You can set that to whatever window you need, and that usually suffices. But if you want to push out a new firmware, it's generally going to be a manual or a semi-manual task. You certainly can't schedule it to happen at a specific time for a specific group of phones, unless you sort of manually did it. I believe there's going to be some kind of solution to that in future releases. I think it's roadmap to try and schedule firmware in a more specific and regimented manner. Other than that, it's a great solution really, and it's very competitively priced, I have to say. So, and the great story about using RPRM, for instance, is that you now have an almost end-to-end solution for your phones and your UC platform. So before you had Skype for Business and you had maybe Event Zero and you had Polycom phones, and it was always a matter of, well, who do I go to support when things don't quite work as expected? Whereas if you use RPRM, you really have only got two places to look at. You know, if the phone is registering and it's all looking fine, then it's probably going to be a Skype issue, and you're probably going to get support from Microsoft ultimately, unless you can resolve it elsewhere. But if a phone's not getting a specific profile, maybe it's not provisioning right, then your support for phones is going to be Polycom. So it's a much more defined and streamlined support model, and that's kind of a big win. And if I'm being completely honest, that's kind of the USP for RPRM, to be fair, above all other solutions. Let's just sign in to link. So we'll just wait for that to log in. And now you can see that the phones have automatically logged in as common area phones, and I have paging configured. So if I wanted to page a group, I can click on paging. I've got services there, I can say page, and people in the group will get a page. So, and if we come to the monitor tab now, here what is quite useful is that if you look into the other files, here we can see that we've got the calls XML file. If we have a look at the calls and XML file, what this will do is records the call list. So when you dial an extension, for instance, it's going to save that call history to that XML file, so that if you restart the phone, factory reset it, and the call detail records weren't stored anywhere else, then when the phone gets provisioned again, that call record is pushed back to the phone, so you have all the history, which is quite a neat little trick. So anyway, I've been talking too long now on this demo, so I hope you've enjoyed it and found it informative. And if you have any questions, please contact me via my blog.